icon, then play.
It's 1995. The world of video games is about to enter a new era, an era of 3D.
Nintendo video games.
Nintendo has introduced some hot new toys.
New Nintendo 64.
Nintendo's newest release is causing a commotion.
Gamers all over the world sit with bated breath as they impatiently await their favorite 2D games to be translated into 3D. But unbeknownst to them, the developers in charge of bringing their favorite 2D worlds into the third dimension have no idea what they're doing. A series of technical limitations will limit most games' creativity and potential.
It was bad. The jumping, the camera angles, it should have been called buggy 3D, am I right?
One group at Nintendo, while making The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, would try to work within the confines of these limitations until a desire for a horse of all things would force them to go beyond and break those barriers.
However, there would be no rule book for what they were about to embark on because they were writing it as they went. Each obstacle, each new issue that they encountered would be the first of its kind, and they would need to solve it in a new and inventive way. It starts with Yoshiaki Koizumi. Here, he scribbles down that he wants Shambaro-style action, horse riding, and archery, but there's no time to realize this idea because he's working with Shigeru Miyamoto on Super Mario 64, a game that will one day define the 3D platformer. Despite taking on this Herculean task, Miyamoto, Koizumi, and others are already thinking about the future, and for them, the future is The Legend of Zelda.
When development for my game, a game that would be considered one of the best games of all time, did officially begin, it started off with just 3 people, Jin Akita, Toru Asawa, and Yoshiaki Koizumi. They all started to work in a department within Nintendo known as the Entertainment Analysis and Development Division, or EAD. Though the development team would eventually grow to utilize everyone that worked at EAD, those 3 pioneers oversaw breaking ground.
Translating a 2D game into 3D had a host of fundamental challenges. Taking a game that had a set formula and gameplay mechanics, throwing said mechanics out the window because you've added another dimension which changes movement, perspective, and control, while also trying to retain the same formula people loved about the 2D game, is a complicated puzzle to solve. The inspiration for Zelda 64 would come from Chanbara. Chanbara is what we in English would refer to as a samurai film. The visuals of noble samurai facing off against enemies while on a righteous quest was the guiding star when creating Zelda 64. The idea was to have Link, the main character, use his sword in combat in the video game in 2 ways, Link versus one opponent and Link versus many. Both would prove challenging. Another inspiration for Zelda 64 would come from Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, a 2D side-scrolling game with a focus on combat over puzzle solving. By having Zelda 64 be a 3D game in a 2D side perspective, they were hoping to solve issues that they foresaw even before development started. One of the many takeaways from Super Mario 64 was just how important movement was to a 3D video game. 2D video games typically utilize movement on 4 different axes: up, down, left, and right, or just left and right. However, traversing a 3D environment would need 6 axes of movement and 360 rotation. Typically, movement was handled by using a D-pad, which allowed for the 4 axes of movement. Then there was the joystick, which allowed movement on 6 axes and 360 rotation, but they were big and meant your hand would always have to be holding it. The solution for this was simple. Shrink the joystick down to the size of a D-pad so it could be used with just one thumb. And thus, the analog stick was born. But as is often the case when creating something new, finding a solution for one problem can cause different problems down the line. With so many ways to move, how do you get Link to face the right direction to fight one opponent, let alone multiple? In Super Mario 64, enemies were often coming at you from one direction, or they were repeating the same movement pattern, which made it easier for you to fight them. This worked well for Mario, but Link's movement needed to be more precise, especially considering that they wanted to have Shambara-style fighting. By putting the game in a 2D side perspective, they would ensure that Link was always facing the right direction. The problem with this, however, was twofold. They would be able to have Link fight opponents one-on-one, but what about multiple?
I don't know if this was the game that Zelda fans would really want, especially after follow-up to Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. Hard to say what fans were expecting. But there was the Space World demo.
Created by Gal Goddard, the Space World 1995 demo was a tech demo that was meant to demonstrate the power of the Nintendo 64 and not showcase a game that was in active development. It was meant to show what a Zelda game on the Nintendo 64 could be like. Goddard would say, "I think they just wanted to show something because they announced the game and they wanted to show that they actually had a game there, even though they had nothing."
Nintendo could have done a better job at highlighting it was just a tech demo and not an actual game. It might have set an unfair expectation for the fans. Luckily, they wouldn't do that again.
They would in fact do that again.
Oh.
At Space World 2000, they showed this. But we got this.
I'm not apologizing.
Another suggestion that was made early on was by Shigeru Miyamoto. His idea was to have the game in first person. In his mind, this would allow the players to better take in the environment, as well as to allow the developers to focus more on enemies and dungeons. This would also allow for Link to face the appropriate direction when fighting an enemy. Essentially, they would be creating Elder Scrolls, but Zelda. This would make things easier because they would also have a host of first-person video games to draw from. The responsibility of creating the first-person prototype fell on Kazumi, but he would quietly refuse and not even try to work on it. Kazumi would say, "From my experience making Super Mario 64, I knew that displaying a character constantly running around on a broad field would be incredibly difficult. But while it wasn't very nice of me toward Miyamoto-san, I didn't try a first-person scene even once." The other idea was to have Link traverse the 3D environment in third person, but when he came across an enemy, it would be switched to a side view and a 2D perspective so Link could fight, similar to a fighting game. But none of this felt right for Zelda 64. The idea was to have Link fight opponents one-on-one, and for Link to fight multiple opponents at once, and they hadn't found the perfect solution for both scenarios. So, having hit a wall, and needing to find a creative solution, they did the only sensible thing left. They went to an amusement park. The team goes to Toei Kyoto Park. Yes, that Toei. It's a hot summer's day when they get into the park. Sunlight is bearing down on all the park goers as heat radiates from every direction. Sweat forms on their brows as they trek across the park. As their prayers for a cooling breeze go unanswered, there's only one thing on their mind: get inside to get cool. They search for a place to duck into until they find a theater with a live show. They go in, sit down. The team looks on in the dark, cool theater, but as the lights on the stage turns on and the show begins, Asawa and Kazumi would watch and take away very different things. The show starts with a lone samurai facing off against a horde of ninjas. 20 ninjas move across the stage like shadows to fight our solitary hero. But despite being one against many, the samurai is triumphant, and the ninjas lay slain at his feet. But how is it possible for one man to beat 20 and make it look so convincing? Kazumi watched closely and saw that even though the hero was surrounded by enemies, they would move in one at a time, and only once an enemy was down, the next opponent attacked. He realized that if he could implement this technique in the game, he could have Link fight multiple opponents at once. But for that to work, he would need something to trigger the AI into attacking while signaling the other AI to hold back. Osawa, on the other hand, took notice of the ninja using kusarigama, which is a scythe on a chain. The samurai catches it and pulls it tightly, getting rid of any slack in the chain, and then the ninja moved around the samurai in a circle while holding the other end. Osawa realized that if he could attach an invisible chain between Link and his opponent, then that would ensure Link was always facing the correct direction. One show, two different ideas. But once they got back to the office, they married these ideas together. This was the birth of Z targeting. Using Osawa's idea of locking onto an enemy by attaching an invisible chain to them meant that Link would always be facing his opponent. And this was the missing ingredient for Kozumi's idea. Once an opponent was locked on, it sent a signal to the other enemy's AI to hold back until the first opponent was defeated. This meant that the player could have 6 axes of freedom while still being able to accurately attack enemies while jumping and dodging. But for Z targeting to be implemented successfully, they needed a way to show the player what objects could be targeted. At first they thought of a simple arrow pointing at the objects, but eventually realized this wasn't interesting enough. So they came up with the idea of using a fairy that would follow Link around and would hover over and highlight objects that could be targeted. But because of the graphical limitations, they couldn't have a fully rendered fairy with a body. So they settled on using a ball of light with wings. They called her the Fairy Navigation System, or Navi for short. She would serve as your companion throughout the game, helping you target things of interest while also answering questions and giving you tips. Her sound effects are amongst the most iconic sounds in gaming, and though not all Zelda fans love her, I always thought she was kinda neat. And to be fair, she's far from the most annoying companion you would get in a Zelda game. As the development of the Zelda game continued, more and more people would be brought onto the project, and eventually even Shigeru Miyamoto himself would be brought on to help navigate the ship. One morning, the team goes into the office to find Miyamoto already there, and that he's implemented a new feature, a way to further Link's movement by allowing him to jump. This contribution would be called Auto Jump. As the name suggests, it's a feature that when Link would run off the edge of a tall object, he would automatically jump. This auto jump feature would allow Link to cross gaps and allow for some platforming elements in the game. Link's movement and animation was a key part of Zelda 64, but in their enthusiasm and excitement in making Link's movement as robust as they possibly could, they were laying the groundwork for another serious problem that would completely change Zelda 64. In an attempt to push the boundaries of console gaming even further in the 90s, Nintendo was developing the Nintendo 64 DD, a peripheral that would attach to the Nintendo 64 that would allow for more memory and RAM, and use a floppy disk instead of a cartridge. As the development of Zelda 64 continued, the ideas and concepts began to grow, and as the team's ambition grew, so did their need for memory and storage. Which is why Zelda 64 was going to be released on the 64 DD to utilize the extra memory and RAM. But we know today this didn't happen. If you watched any TV show or movie in the 90s, you would know that a floppy disk held great power, oftentimes contains the means of beckoning or holding off the apocalypse depending on what the plot called for. But the truth is, though the floppy disk at the time could hold a lot of information, it did have its limitations. A floppy disk works by a computer reading the mechanical disk in the center. For instance, in Zelda 64, to make Link move, it would need to seek and access movement data from the floppy disk. You press forward on the analog stick to make Link auto jump. The console's computer sends a signal to spin the floppy disk to find the movement parameter. Once that data is found, it's translated to animation on the screen. This takes time, which is fine if the computer is only seeking a few parameters, but Link's movement in the game had over 500 different parameters, which meant that Link would move very slowly. So the EAD team was faced with another hard decision, whether to prioritize memory or speed.
They decided to prioritize my speed and use a cartridge. This meant my movement would be faster, but a cartridge has less memory, so they would need to figure out a way to fit all their ideas in a smaller space.
But working with limited memory wasn't a new challenge. In Super Mario 64, to get around this issue, they had all the levels in the game connect into a hub world, an area in which all the other levels could be accessed from. This was Peach's Castle. Miyamoto, in taking another lesson learned from Super Mario, had the idea to have Link in Ganon's castle, and each room in the castle could be a new level for Link to explore. In his mind, the worst case scenario would be that Link would never leave the castle. At least that was the plan. During the development of Super Mario 64, the team who would eventually work on Zelda 64 often talked about having a horse in the game. Originally, the idea was to have a horse in Mario 64, but when that didn't pan out, it was moved to Zelda. The idea of having a horse roaming a 3D environment was so impactful that Kazumi created a concept of a 3D horse running in a field. Just a 3D horse running in an empty field. After viewing this concept, the team knew they had to have a horse in the game. They wanted to keep the controls simple, so they had the horse auto jump over obstacles when it gained enough speed. Epona would run as she pressed forward on the analog stick, but would get a burst of speed if Link fed her a carrot. However, if you run out of carrots, she slowed down until they refilled automatically over time. But for the player to take full advantage of the horse, it would need a place to run, to sprint, to jump. The team would need to find a way to create a big enough field for traversing on horseback, despite their space issues. They did away with using a hub world for the game, and would create a field that Link could travel through on foot or preferably on horseback. By adding the field, they changed how The Legend of Zelda would be played. It wasn't just about going from one room to the next, but about the act of traversing across a large landscape. Having Link on horseback was a huge technical achievement at the time that offered a novel way to experience the world. There was really nothing like it at the time, and it showed what the hardware could really do. Today, we've become bored of giant worlds with nothing in them, and rightly so. Here it was new and fresh. Back then, it seemed to be no end to how big the field was. Of course, that wasn't true, but the impact of Epona in the field could be felt not only in the future Zelda games, but in a wide variety of games, such as Shadow of the Colossus, Red Dead Redemption 2, The Witcher 3, and many, many more. Games that made traversing the landscape not a chore or a way to draw out the game, but a way to add an immersive experience. And yes, all those other games are far more advanced than Ocarina of Time. But Ocarina was the game that really showed us it could be done. But with the addition of a horse and a field, the scope of the game had to change. And what's the point of having a horse without interesting destinations? The field would be used for Link to access different locations that included such things as pristine waters for him to swim in, a desert with golden sand for him to get lost in, temples with dark secrets for him to battle in, and towns for him to socialize in. Because they weren't using a hub world, that meant everything had to get bigger. Instead of just having rooms, they needed entire towns that would give access to the game's many secrets and dungeons. The field may have been large, but they didn't want it to feel empty, so they hid secrets for the player to discover, enemies for them to battle. A day-night system was implemented in the field, and when the sun set upon Hyrule Field, skeletons would rise from the ground. All this gave Hyrule Field its own character and would ensure that the player's journey from one location to the next was just as important and exciting as the destination. But those destinations were not meticulously planned out before being built. The towns and villages that would make up the world of Hyrule started off as simple and empty, and over the development, the team at EAD would come together to suggest the things they would like to see occupy the space. And as they did, the towns evolved from boring empty spaces into vibrant areas filled with electric people teeming with life and designs that encouraged the players to explore. They may have added things because they thought it would look cool in the space, but it's all organized in such a way that each town has its own personality. Each town comes to life to become a character in its own right. But each place is more than what it seems at first glance. For instance, the Kakariko Village appears to be a small town that's developing and expanding, but after you spend some time exploring and talking to its residents, you begin to realize that there's something very ominous living there. Throughout the game's playthrough, this ominous feeling will grow until you are faced with the realization that not something ominous, but evil has taken residence in this village. In fact, as you peek behind the veil of all these towns and villages, you start to uncover that Hyrule itself is not a magical kingdom from a child's fairy tale, but instead houses a great many secrets. A key part of any Zelda game are the dungeons, a place of special interest that the player needs to explore in order to complete the game. The dungeons in The Legend of Zelda are filled with enemies and puzzles, and oftentimes accessing the dungeon is a puzzle in of itself. One could even argue that the success of a Zelda game is dependent on how good the dungeons are.
The dungeons are horrifying, especially the water temple. Very confusing, very wet. Some people had me stuck in there for weeks.
For the sake of this video, we'll say that The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time has 12 dungeons. 12 obstacles that need to be conquered in order for the player to progress. They range from inside an ancient tree to a literal dungeon hidden in the bottom of a well. So the player understands the mechanics of the dungeons. You start off small with 3 dungeons at the beginning of the game. This serves to help the player understand the mechanics and the basic layout of the dungeons in the game. Very quickly, you realize that the dungeons follow a specific recipe. Find the special item you need to figure out the puzzles to get in. Once inside the dungeon, you figure out the puzzles and fight enemies until you reach the boss. By the time you complete the 3rd dungeon, this pattern and its order of operations is obvious to you. But also after the 3rd dungeon, the difficulty rises. Once inside, you realize the dungeons are bigger. But not only that, in order to progress, you also have to find keys to unlock doors, and only once you've unlocked the doors and found the boss key can you challenge the boss in the dungeon. Each room was designed to feel unique and challenging with its own theme to add to its sense of variety. But a constant obstacle for the developers working on the dungeons were the other developers. E.g. Aonuma, who was now working on Zelda 64, would say about the development of the dungeons. I designed the early dungeons, a new item would be done, and someone would tell me, make sure there isn't any trouble when Link enters this dungeon with this item. I'd be like, come on, tell me that sooner. The items weren't created first and the dungeons created with them in mind, or vice versa, the dungeons being created with the intentions of having certain items used in them. Instead, the items that were pivotal to Link's success in the story and progression of the game were being created in tandem with the world that they were intended to be used in. On the outside, this may seem unorganized or even inefficient, but Aonuma would continue to say, but on the other hand, if you decide the items you're going to put in from the start, it doesn't mean everything would go well. I don't think such a variety of distinctive items would have come about this way. We were making something unprecedented, so we couldn't see what would be right to make or what the goal should be.
It was the Wild West back then. They were flying by the seat of their pants.
And through this approach, they were able to come up with creative solutions to problems that they weren't expecting to have. They were given the space and the time to let their creativity flow, and the outcome was a game unlike anything anyone had played at the time. So now, with the villages and dungeons created, the next step was to create characters to inhabit them. For the most part, it seems, the most streamlined process of the development was the character creation. Artists would sketch the characters' designs to give them their basic shape, and the animators and story would give them their actual character. Yoshiki Haruhana would say about the characters he designed, I made a considerable conscious effort to make sure players would remember who they would run into if they went around a particular corner. Since characters are essentially people, there's a tendency to think that their faces are important. But I pay more attention to their figures. Sometimes I shape the figure first, then think about the face. Games can't do much with just close-up of the characters' faces, so I think what grabs people more than the overall facial characteristics is a memorable overall shape. As you walk around and explore the game, you meet new characters, and for one reason or another, they leave a lasting impact on you. Each person here somehow has their own story, their own desires, whether they're a love-struck couple dancing in the middle of a town, or a grumpy foreman upset by his lackadaisical sons. They all have their own individual reasons for existing. Now, with a year and a half left in the development of the game, Miyamoto would make a request that sent ripples across the development that would shake up the dungeons, items, characters, and stories.
With little over a year until the release of the game, Miyamoto-san made the suggestion to introduce an additional Link. A younger Link.
What's up?
Were you at all upset with them adding an additional Link after thinking you would be the only main character?
No, I wasn't upset, but I also didn't think they could do it. They were running out of space on the cartridge, if you remember.
But then the team realized they could just scale down adult Link's movement to allow me to use them. That only increased the size by 1.5, so they were able to fit me on the cartridge.
Yep, I didn't see that coming.
They had amazing dungeons, a large field, creative characters, and 2 Links. All these individual elements of the game are great on their own. However, to be amazing, they needed something to tie them all together cohesively, and that's where the story comes in. As you can imagine, the story went through many different changes and iterations throughout the course of the development, with multiple people putting in their input. Ultimately, the final story was very simple. It was almost as basic of a hero's journey as you can get. Link gets a call to action, he leaves home, he meets a mysterious mentor almost immediately, deals with challenges, crosses over the abyss, has a literal transformation, defeats evil, and is forever changed. But it wasn't the script that made the story special, but rather, it was everything else that I've mentioned before. The characters, the dungeons, and everything the player would experience. Aonuma would say, a lot of people say they like the epic story, but on the level of the script, the story isn't actually that epic. The script was simple, but what the characters experience along the way is what made the story epic. However, key moments would still need to be highlighted, and for that, the team turned to cutscenes. But Miyamoto was not a fan of cinematics in video games. He largely thought they were unnecessary. This was due to the fact that at the time, cutscenes were pre-rendered, meaning that they were video files that would be shown during the game. Everything would be rendered beforehand, and oftentimes, the models they would use were of a higher resolution than the ones in the video game, which meant switching from cutscene to gameplay would often be jarring. And because of how The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was being developed, items, gameplay, and story would need to change often, so they ran the risk of rendering a cinematic and then something needing to change. And creating those cinematics took time and money. Changing them wouldn't be easy, which meant that they might not be able to implement certain mechanics. Imagine a world where young Link isn't added in the game because they couldn't change a cinematic.
Now,
to get around this and to further prove how ahead of the time they were, they made a way to make in-game cutscenes. An in-game cutscene opposed to a pre-rendered cutscene captures the actual gameplay environment, models, and their animation in real time as the game is playing. This meant they could implement as many changes in the game as they wanted and easily change the cinematics. This is a common practice nowadays, but was rarely done at the time. Having in-game cutscenes allowed them to tell a more cohesive story while highlighting particular story beats while still having room for creative flexibility. One such cutscene was the game's opening cinematic, which featured an adult Link on horseback as he traversed Hyrule Field at night, silhouetted by the full moon. This scene has become iconic for its visuals, as well as its music. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time story would focus heavily on music, as an ocarina is first and foremost a musical instrument. Music was essential to the story in the game. In the land of Hyrule, music had magic properties and affected how you interacted with the world around you. One song could bring down rain, another could change day to night. The music would be key to setting the mood as well as solutions to multiple puzzles. To do this, EAD turned to longtime Nintendo collaborator Koji Kondo. With the advent of the Nintendo 64, it just wasn't graphics that got an upgrade, so did sound. Gone were the 8-bit MIDI soundtracks of the days of old and replaced instead with music we swore at the time sounded like a fully fledged orchestra. But the reality was all this music in the game, no matter how memorable it was, no matter how epic it sounded, only used 5 notes. Koji Kondo would explain, "I had to create all those memorable tunes with only 5 tones of the classical do-re-mi scale, specifically re, fa, la, and ti, and the higher scale, re. Since each of those songs, like Zelda's Lullaby and Epona's song, had a particular theme, it was quite challenging, but I think it all felt really natural in the end." The music, though simple, was crucial to setting the mood and the tone of the game. No matter where you go in the world, it's accompanied by an accompaniment of tones that captivated us all and still continues to captivate us now. Despite the delays and the changes, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time would launch to critical and commercial success. All over the globe, people will be opening up Christmas presents, birthday gifts, walking out of places like KB Toys and Funkoland completely unaware of the impact it would have on them. And there's more to this legend than what I've told here. There's the scrapped expansion, there's the sequel Majora's Mask, all of which I do plan on making videos for. So if you don't want to miss it, make sure you subscribe.